everyone. Just wanted to welcome you to one of the first episodes that we have of the Procurement Chronicles, possibly the first, depending on how the editing goes and which ones get shifted first. Today we're going to be talking with Alonso De Rutte and going to have him kind of walk through his story. Alonso, before we kind of jump into your story, do you want to give a little bit of a background of who you are, where you're at today, before we kind of go back in time and talk about your childhood?
Sure. So my name is Alonso De Rutte. I work in procurement. I've been in procurement for about 12 years now. I'm originally from Peru. I came to the U.S. when I was 8. I grew up in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Went to Elizabeth High School, went to Rutgers, and then, I didn't plan on being procurement. When I went to school, I didn't know what procurement was. I started out with accounting, and then, through networking, through different opportunities, I ended up where I am here.
Great. So that's a good executive summary that we'll walk through. So you mentioned you're born in Peru. You moved to the United States. At what point? What age were you? Anything relevant in that around where you became as a professional?
I was 8, and I really think at 8 it's a little bit of a transition, right? So I was old enough to really remember being in Peru and going to school there. So I had to adapt to a new country, a new language, new friends, new everything, right? New weather. Everything was brand new. And I think that was an experience that helped me later on to become, adaptable to different companies, different ways of working, different cultures, right? Like, for example, the culture at a place like a Unilever is very different from a pharmaceutical company, where it's much more structured, and Unilever is much more relaxed, much more modern, much more t-shirt and jeans, So I think having that flexibility to adapt to both has served me well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And when you came into the U.S., where did you move to? What area did you guys settle in?
Elizabeth, New Jersey. The same spot. Well, not the same house, but the same area where I am now. I could probably walk to the house where I grew up in.
Okay, good. So New Jersey native.
Yes.
One thing we talked about. So in this podcast, we've done a preparation interview, and I've had some conversation with you already. One thing that you had mentioned in our initial discussion that I find a little bit hard to believe is that you're an introvert. But you mentioned that you're an introvert, but you do enjoy working with teams, and that was really in the context of your childhood. And it's how do you think that plays into being an immigrant at the age of 8? Is that relevant, or is that something that is just kind of at the core of who you are?
I think it's just the core of who I am, right? I always remember being on the quieter side. Compared to some of my other friends, my cousins, and as far as it's odd, right? But I think everybody's a little bit like that. I think it's very few people that are one extreme, right? So I definitely like the analytical aspects of working on my own, of my spreadsheet, of playing with the numbers. Like, I can really geek out in that, but I also at the same time, when I like I mentioned to you, right? Like, I'm not a salesperson. Like, that's just not me, right?
Yeah.
That's not a strength I have. But I do enjoy interacting with other people. Like, how was your day? What do you think of this report? What do you think of that? Feedback. So it's a little bit of a blend, I would say.
Yeah, maybe you enjoy interacting with people that you have relationships with, but maybe it's a little more challenge or outside of your comfort zone when it's new relationships, prospecting for the first time.
Right, exactly.
Okay. Another thing you mentioned, I think in our discussion before, you went to Rutgers. Mentioned you're a first generation college graduate. How did that come to be? I mean, what was what kind of drove you to go to college, coming from a family where that hadn't happened in the past?
Yeah, I think, in spite of them not going to college themselves, my parents always pushed, for education. They worked hard for me to, really have the opportunity to go to college. And I knew that it was something that would allow me to, not just from an earnings perspective, right, which obviously usually the earnings of a college graduate are are higher than people who don't go to. Although that's debatable nowadays, right? But I knew that. I knew that historically, right? But I knew that the opportunity to go to college was something that to someone with my background, it wasn't always available. So I really wanted to make the most of it.
Yeah, that's big. And I don't know if we touched on this, but what did your parents do to provide for a living? Did that kind of factor into your decision to go to college, and or some kind of lessons that you learned later that affected your career?
Yeah, my mom worked at a daycare, and my dad did real estate. And I think from their perspective, I think both of them would have liked to maybe have gone to college and had like a different career path. But given where they were in their respective lives, right, it just wasn't an option for them at the time. So that was something that was what they did, and like what they enjoyed, I suppose.
No, it's the American dream, right? I mean, the idea of immigrating from Peru, setting up a life for your child that is so that they have access to some things that are kind of out of reach for you. Kind of sounds like the kind of traditional thing that America's been built on. So Rutgers, I mean, you mentioned you'd gone to Rutgers. How was your experience there? What did you start off wanting to study? How did things evolve from there?
Rutgers, honestly, and we touched upon this a little bit last time. So I was very, very overwhelmed going to Rutgers. I feel that I wasn't prepared for having so many choices, right? Like anything that you want to study with, not procurement, which is what I actually ended up doing, what was available, right? So I feel like, rather than just picking one major or one concentration, I ended up, at first I wanted to major in math, then I wanted to major in economics, then I wanted to major in Portuguese. So I feel like I was all over the place. And part of that is having so many options, right? So while it's a good thing, right, that you can study whatever you want, sometimes having too many choices can kind of work against you, right? Like going to the Cheesecake Factory and seeing 100 cheesecakes. It's like, oh my God, which one am I going to pick? So that's kind of how I felt like.
Cheesecake Factory is a good analogy because that's like a 50-page menu, and it's impossible to order from.
Like, can you please just pick for me and just...
We've all experienced it, yeah. And I always seem to order the thing that makes me sick. So, a recurring theme as I've been kind of preparing for these initial interviews with different procurement professionals is a lot of people actually didn't major in procurement or supply chain or a related field in college. It sounds like you kind of found your way there in the college experience. What motivated you to go that route? It sounds like you looked in mathematics, you looked in other fields. How did what light bulb clicked that made you think this is something you wanted to pursue as a major and ultimately a career?
So I was studying accounting, and I realized very late on that road that I didn't enjoy accounting and I didn't want to do it. Fortunately for me, we had electives. And one of the electives was an introduction to supply chain management, and I enjoyed that much more. So what I ended up doing, since I had already completed my what they called core courses, I just had to complete the supply chain management specific courses. So it didn't take me much longer. So I was able to complete both concentrations. So I have an accounting degree that I never really did anything with, and also one in supply chain management.
I think that's great. I mean, that's a great combo. I don't think you see a lot. I actually did accounting and information systems as two different degrees. Kind of a similar concept. Hey, it's not a lot extra to just get this second concentration. But I don't think I knew anyone at the school I was going to, University of Utah, that combined accounting with supply chain. I mean, do you feel like as much as you didn't enjoy it, accounting, do you feel like your knowledge of accounting, how has that affected how you view supply chain, how you approach supply chain procurement as a professional? Or is there no way or is that just not really a big difference? Because I imagine having that background is gonna set you aside from some of your peers.
Yeah, I think while the background per se is not it doesn't necessarily benefit me. I feel a lot of the skills that I developed in accounting are transferable, right? Like for example, I can read through a financial statement or contract pretty quickly and find things that are relevant, right? So being able to do that, I think is something that has been useful for me throughout the years.
Okay, I'd imagine just understanding financial terms better, or having more exposure to financial terms, especially when you get into some more complex contractual arrangements during the procurement process. That probably puts you in a good spot to be able to, kind of figure out how it all fits together when there's, maybe 4 or 5 different revenue streams coming in for the supplier or the vendor.
Right. Like the analogy that I like, right, is when it comes to these skills, like the analytics, the Excel, in my case, Access, being able to read a contract, be comfortable with ratios and comparisons.
Yes.
Is like I think of Michael Jordan, right? Probably the best or one of the best basketball players of all time. He chose basketball, but if he had gone into football or anything else, he probably would have done all right.
He would
had
have done
the
okay.
base. He had the base skills to kind of excel at anything. So I think accounting provided a solid foundation to take in different directions.
Great. I like that. I like that. As a fellow accountant in college, at least, I can sympathize that with a bit. So, and I think one thing you'd mentioned, I'm just kind of, if I'm looking off the screen for a second, I'm just reviewing the notes from our last discussion. When you went into accounting, I think we discussed how you kind of did that because it was the pragmatic thing to do, right? It was like the sensible thing to do. Any kind of color around that?
Yeah. So I think one thing that kind of stands out, right, is the balance, right? So I went into school. I always enjoyed, which I think I've shared with you, reading about the economy, the state of the economy, inflation, economics. So I thought, I'm going to study economics because that's what I like, right? I didn't take into account the marketability of that degree. Like I thought, I'm going to be an economist and I'm going to work for a central bank, and reality hit, and then I realized like, I just have to. I'm basically a business major, like like the central bank that I had envisioned is not going to hire me. Like there's a huge pool to pick from. So I was like, all right, so I need something more marketable. So then there's accounting, right? Accountants are everywhere. But I didn't particularly enjoy accounting, so now I had a marketable degree that I didn't really like. So I had the worst of both worlds, if you will.
That's good. I mean, you went from a macro, you really were kind of enamored around the macroeconomic side, and honestly, moving into supply chain and accounting business, you kind of just take similar type of an interest and move into more of a micro view, how it operates in a specific organization, the money coming in, the money going out. So, I mean, I can see how it would lead there. And I think a lot of people do, go into accounting because of exactly what you said. It's a good field to go into. You're going to have a job when you come out. But one thing that has been recurring, because I've had some of these initial discussions, is, the lack of the lack of kind of sponsorship and exposure university students have historically gotten in supply chain and procurement. It sounds like your entry point to taking that as a career path, but first as a major, was that you took a course in it and like, hey, I enjoy this. I think I could do this well, and I think this is something that kind of fits with what I'm doing. I mean, were there any other programs when you were in college that, aside from taking that course, where you were exposed to supply chain procurement as a career path, or was it just 100% that course?
There were other courses that piqued my interest, but definitely the supply chain one was the one that I enjoyed the most. Part of the program was exposing you to different I guess, areas, right, such as marketing, legal, and one of them was supply chain. And out of the ones that I took, that was the one that I enjoyed the most.
Nice. Okay, great. Just looking through my notes, make sure we don't miss anything in your university years. I think one thing we talked about, so when you started into the supply chain program, I think this is within your bachelor's, and correct anything I'm remembering incorrectly. I believe that the master's program really wasn't even established yet, and that came later. Is that a correct remembrance? Can you kind of walk me through I think while you were at Rutgers, that supply chain master's program came out. How did that, kind of tie into your personal story?
Yes, that's exactly right. So when I was selecting a major, when I was selecting a major to study for my master's degree, I chose accounting. But at the time, supply chain management was not even available. It wasn't until my last year of my master's that it was officially a program. So I took a course out of the program, but I wasn't in the program. So yeah, it was really interesting. It came out the year that I was going to graduate. And now it's an established program, right, with several, I'm old, so several years of success. But at the time, in 2009, that was the first year that, I'm sure other schools had it, but the first year that Rutgers had a official supply chain management program.
Okay, that's interesting. So coming out of Rutgers, new supply chain program, can you kind of walk us through your early career? What were you doing coming out of college? And how did that kind of first career experience unfold?
Yeah, that was one thing that I, not being officially part of the program, kind of came back to haunt me a little bit. So I was part of the accounting program, and when I switched and did supply chain management, they didn't include me as part of their program, so I didn't get any career services assistance from them. I tried talking to deans and talking to different people. It didn't get me anywhere, which is unfortunate, right? Because I was part of the program. But nonetheless, so then when I graduated, the career services program for the accounting program were focused on accounting jobs, so they weren't able to help me get a supply chain job. And the supply chain career services program was refusing to work with me because I was part of the accounting program. So I was like, great. And meanwhile, they had no problems collecting my tuition, right? But that's neither here nor there. So then I graduate. Yeah. So then I graduated, and I found myself basically having to start from scratch, right? So networking, going to networking events, going to career fairs, doing the online thing. At the time, career services was big, Monster, LinkedIn, and through that, I got some. I started consulting, and I that's how I landed my first job.
Awesome. So you kind of were, again, a man with no home, not able to really leverage probably a really good career services program. I would imagine a university like Rutgers is so well known, but you had a concentration in supply chain, but we're stuck having to recruit for accounting jobs if you wanted to use that.
Right.
And you mentioned you ended up in consulting your initial position. Can you kind of walk us through that, kind of moving on from your college years, your university years? What was that first position like? What did you learn about it? What did you like about it? What were some of the challenges?
Yeah, one thing that I think a lot of people can relate to is that, once you graduate and, real life hits pretty hard, pretty quickly. So I would have liked perhaps more time to really do a deep dive into what company I wanted to work for and go through that application process, right? But at the same time, I was well aware that, I needed income. Like, I had bills, and my student loans were going to start coming in, and they weren't going to wait for me to find the quote-unquote the perfect job, right? So I felt a little pressured to find something. So I was fortunate that I was able to find something that gave me an entry level experience to build my resume and also grow that networking pool, which is really important in this industry.
Great, yeah, and any just kind of going through some of my notes here. I think one of the things you mentioned, I think in this initial role, you started to work with the ERP systems. Any kind of color around that topic?
Yes. So the ERP system I work with was SAP, and SAP I think is the gold standard in ERP systems, right? So being able to add that to my resume as well as being comfortable and working with it proved to be a real asset till this day, throughout my career, right? Even though my current role doesn't use SAP, a lot of those skills were transferable. Knowing what a purchase order is, knowing what a purchase requisition is, the flow of that, how to find different analytics, I think are skills that, so I guess what I'm saying is, even though if I use a different platform, just knowing that it's possible to find it is an asset, right, over someone who's never used it before.
Great. And another thing we kind of talked about that I think applies to that first role, and also your decision, kind of going back to your decision to do the MBA. I think you'd mentioned, within your organization, and this isn't always the case. I think you made a joke, you quipped at the beginning, how education and its necessities kind of shifted in some industries. But where you were at, you felt like there was a different kind of a weight to someone who had gotten a master's, who'd gotten an MBA. Any additional kind of feedback or thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's kind of what got the ball rolling in the first place, right? So at the company I was at, I feel like candidates who came in with an MBA into the rotational program that I was in, that came in with an MBA, not only did they come in with a higher salary, but they also they had a certain level of prestige, if you will, right? Yeah. And how much more qualified they were for the role is very questionable, but there was definitely a certain level of status that came with it, and the benefits that come with that, right? Salary, title, etc. So that's one thing that kind of said, like, hey, I want this. So I went in pursuit of my own MBA.
I think we had the discussion before. You had an analogy I really liked, which is kind of the military, right? In the military, there's enlisted individuals, and there's the officer track, and often you could have an enlisted person that has 10, 15, 20 years of experience, a very significant enlisted rank, and yet when someone comes in through the officer track, probably a second lieutenant out of college, they can kind of leapfrog individuals who might have more experience. So it's a kind of a cheat code to get ahead.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that analogy.
At least at this company, right?
At least this company, right? And culturally, yeah. I think it's shifting. I mean, I think it, but I think you're going to see it's going to, it's never going to hurt you, right? It's never going to hurt you. But at some organizations, it's more important than others. I don't think it ever hurts you to have it on the resume. But yeah, it is interesting to kind of see the shift as especially I wonder if COVID and 2020 are going to speed some of those things up, as I think less people accessed universities, or they did more things online. That'll be to be seen. So okay, so kind of moving into your later career. So I have notes here saying that you felt like there was a bit of a boom coming out of college. There was a lot of demand. Rutgers could ensure a lot of placement, but you were in the wrong area. Coming out of your initial position, moving into to Honeywell. I mean, what was the, how did you end up at Honeywell, and what did you learn there? What was different about that position than where you started off?
Yeah, at Honeywell, I was very involved with the, I would say, logistics aspect of it, right? So if there was an order and it was late or a status was needed, I was in charge of tracking it down, and that involved a lot of the dirty work of an SAP or ERP system, right? Of manually going in, putting in the order, seeing the status, updating the relevant buyers or people that were interested in its status. And that was different from my previous role. My previous role, I was more of a planner. So I was more involved with demand planning, looking at trends, taking into account seasonality for future orders. Whereas here, I was more of a requisitioner, if you will, putting in the requisitions, checking their status, making updates as needed. So a little, I mean, procurement supply chain is a very big space, right?
Yep.
So I feel like there's many different roles and functions that you can be involved in.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the first time you had just kind of taken my notes here. It's the first time you kind of worked in the chemical space. The one thing is we kind of talked through your career. I think you've kind of going back to your original characteristic that was built by moving to the U.S. and being an immigrant is your adaptability. But this was kind of the first time you'd worked in the chemical space. It seems like you've had to adapt to different types of companies, different types of roles throughout your career. But is that accurate that this is kind of the first time working in the chemical space on the procurement?
Yeah, so I went in kind of confident, thinking like, all right, I can procure. I have a background in procurement, right? And all of my maybe with the exception of one or two, everyone there was an engineer, right? And it was like another language. It was like, an AC cable and DC cable. I'm like, what? What's that? Converter. And it was seriously like, I was doing the buying, but I didn't know what I was buying. So that's a case where I think, particularly in that field, where having a background in chemicals or engineering, would be very, very useful. Because of the technicality of what you're purchasing.
Yeah, and I think it's a good call out. Listeners to this podcast, which I think a lot of them are going to end up being, as it develops in college, early career. Procurement isn't procurement. You felt like there was a pretty big learning curve on the slang, lingo, nomenclature in that specific company because of the chemical spend, and you almost had to be. You almost had to have a swirl of engineering in you by the time you really started to feel comfortable with the role and kind of understanding what you were buying, what you're doing.
Yeah, it definitely would have come in handy. That's for sure.
Yeah. So I think career choices for those who are transitioning into procurement or have some type of a pre-life if they're in college. If there's an area that you're passionate about outside of procurement, it might be good to work in a company that's in that type of a vertical. Okay, we had a little bit of technical difficulty using a new podcast tool, which I will not name by name. Hopefully we're able to get that loaded, and we'll just mix that back in after. So I think what we were talking about, when your initial role as a contractor, then moving into your role at Honeywell. At that contractor, you really got exposure to multiple companies, multiple types of procurement environments. Any kind of feedback or thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, starting out with one company and kind of growing in that company is perhaps the ideal, but that wasn't my experience, right? My experience was I was consulting, and I spent 6 months to a year at different companies. So while obviously there's a clear advantage of being with one company and growing from within, I think my strength lies at working at different companies, different industries, and seeing what worked and what didn't at each. So I think that's a different career path, right? That some of it was my choice, some of it wasn't, but I think I made the most of it.
Yeah, you got that type of experience. So, let's see here. So I just want to move down. I know. Let's see here. So at some point you ended up over at Unilever. I think you had kind of some feelings about how that operated as a procurement program. Can you kind of give us the background on how you ended up at Unilever, what it looked like, what your experience was there?
Yeah, after consulting for a while, I was looking for a job, for a new employment, and I was fortunate to land a procurement role with Unilever. And at Unilever, like I had mentioned prior, right, they are a world-class procurement organization. Their procurement, methods and protocols are, they're industry leaders, like for sure. So I think that gave me a clear very clear idea of what a procurement process should look like, right? In my experience afterwards, I've been with companies that did not have such a ideal procurement, organization layout in place. So I've done, I was able to contribute and kind of get them a little closer to what that ideal would look like. And it's not always possible because Unilever is a huge international company with tons of resources, whereas some of the companies that I've been at are not. So they can't implement some of the IT resources, or just have some of the high-end ERP systems like the SAP that we were talking about earlier. But I think having an understanding of what those tools can do allows you to kind of create workarounds or work with what you have to get as close as you can to that.
And what were some of the the elements? So going to Unilever, you're seeing a very mature, let's just call it a mature, a complete procurement process. What were some of the elements that were new? I mean, in that environment, what were some things that were more mature and developed that you really hadn't had exposure to prior to that position?
So the ability to have all of the information that I could want or need at my fingertips, right? So if I was working with supplier A, for example, right, I could quickly see the history of supplier A, how much we spent with them in a year, in a quarter, by site, by department, even by buyer. And that gave me a lot of leverage in negotiating with them in the future, right? Also, it helped me negotiate internally if I was trying to work with internal stakeholders that wanted to go in a different direction. I could say, hey, like site A, B, C, D are saving 10% by working with this supplier, and you're, paying more. So having that by working with a different supplier. So having that quick access gave me a huge advantage, right? Whereas some other places where I've been at, without giving any names, right? Some other places where I've been at is, it's a little more difficult retrieving that information, right? For example, there's one where I wouldn't be able to get access to spend data. I would have to ask somebody for it. Then I would have to wait for them to retrieve it and then give it to me. And that's valuable time, right? Like if a contract's coming close to expiration and I want to go negotiate and I want to schedule that, by the time I schedule it, by the time I get the data, I don't have a lot of time to kind of set up my strategy. So I think that having those tools allowed for a much more efficient, contract management, supplier management, process.
No, I think I love what you just said there. I don't think you even had talked through that in our initial discussion, but what I'm hearing about that Unilever procurement environment is you felt enabled because you had visibility, you had access to things you need, and I think one of the lessons that could be learned there, because not like you said, most organizations aren't of the size where they're going to be able to have the same resources that Unilever has. They're going to have to choose what they can do and what they can't do, but removing roadblocks, removing kind of red tape that keeps decision makers from being able to have information is probably a good way to make sure your organization, your procurement department, your supply chain is operating efficiently.
Right, and also something that's perhaps not resource, not a resource thing, but more of a process or mentality or organization thing is Unilever was more decentralized than some other places, and there was a lot of even though the process was very structured, there was room for you to improve it, or it was easy to follow, or to ask questions. Whereas some other places, like there's a process for a process for a process, right? So it's the learning curve is much higher than it is at Unilever, where it's just easier to flow.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so what so it sounds like you had a good experience there. Definitely got to be a part of, learn some best in class um, uh, practices. Where'd you end up next, and how did that come about?
Yep, I ended up with Bic Graphic in Clearwater, Florida. I ended up there as it presented an opportunity to grow. Right, I feel that I was going to move from senior analyst to regional manager, and that was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up. Right, and in hindsight, was it the best idea? Probably not, but I do think that it was a jump in my career that I've been able to maintain since. So that was a big benefit.
Yeah, and I think so. This is the first time you're leaving. Is this the first time you're leaving New Jersey area and kind of moving
for a permanent move? Well, I thought it was permanent at the time. Yeah, it was the first time I left.
Okay, so you kind of said goodbye to winter for a little bit, headed down to Florida, and I think
goodbye to winter and high to humidity. Yep,
high humidity. And I'm out in Gilbert, Arizona, so I know heat. I don't know humidity, but I know heat. Okay. Down in, I think one thing we talked about too, and I think this is going to be, especially in these initial podcasts, this is, most people are going to listen to podcasts in the future, right? There's going to be at some future date. So this is, 11/11/2021. We're just, hopefully towards the end of a global pandemic. I believe, if I remember correctly, when you moved down to Florida, that's kind of around the time that the global pandemic hit. Is that, am I remembering that correctly? And how did that affect onboarding to a new team and how you're interacting with that new team? And, even just, how did you keep from going insane, from being more isolated now that you've kind of moved away from your support network in New Jersey?
Yeah, so I was at a new role for just shy of 3 months, and then the pandemic hit, and it was working from home permanently. So as if transitioning into a new state and a new culture wasn't enough of a shock, you throw the pandemic into the mix. So I was like, all right, so not only do I have no family, no friends, but I also can't really leave my house for, unless it's an emergency. So I was like, all right then. So that was a transition, right? And then working from home remotely kind of made me realize, like we were talking before, right, that I'm more on the introverted side, but not having any contact with anybody for weeks was different. Was definitely different. Like I actually looked forward to having, conference calls because I'd be able to talk to somebody. So
you see human faces.
Yeah, I was like, oh, this is great. I know you're asking me about this report, but nonetheless, it's nice that have someone listen to me and be able to listen to someone. It's it was cool.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Yeah, and I can't remember. Were you able to even meet your team at BIC before things started to get shut down?
Well, by then I was already at Amgen.
Okay.
So I was able to meet them as I was already 3 months into the role when the pandemic hit. So I was able to associate a live person with the image.
Okay, good. That's nice. You're actually able to have some type of a personal experience before things have been shut down. So, and just to hit on that more, because I think it seems like something we talk about a ton right now, but I think in future years is going to be an interesting topic. What types of things did you do? I mean, to keep so you're away from your support network. You're down in Florida. The whole world's kind of shut down for months. Are there certain, other than just getting excited about conference calls, any type of self-care, any type of approach you took to kind of keep yourself from going?
So I like going to the gym a lot, and they closed the gym. So I didn't even have that. So I was like, all right, what am I going to do? So and I was at an apartment building, so I couldn't really, I had neighbors. I couldn't really lift weights in my place because it would make noise. And I was like, all right. So on the door ledge, the frame, I would do pull-ups there, push-ups. Like it felt like a prison, like a really nice prison, right? Because I had a beautiful balcony and view, but nonetheless. So I started cycling. And I got really into cycling, so I was like, all right, this is one thing I can do where it's just me, So yeah, that's one thing I would do for self-care. When I wasn't working, I would do cycling, and I think that was very helpful, and not just from a fitness thing, but also mentally, you know.
Yeah. So you're kind of missing your fitness outlet. Kind of find a hobby that you can't even go to the gym, and so you find a hobby that incorporates that a little bit, gets you outside of the house in a kind of a safe environment. So, okay. So, without getting too far into those two roles and the different teams, I think you'd mentioned at Amgen there was a lot of compliance and marketing. Any additional kind of context around that? What you were doing at Amgen?
Yeah, a lot of, I would say almost exclusively contract management. There was some RFPs as well, but for my particular team, it was contracts and red lines and working with the respective teams to get those resolved.
Great, and then I think you prodigal son headed down to Florida, left home. How did you I think you went from that role to your current role. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct. So
Part of the motivation was also kind of getting a little closer to home, but I'll let you kind of walk us through that.
So my mom was going through also because of the pandemic. She had gone. She was kind of down, and she was financially going through a hard time. So since I knew that I was going to be working remotely for the foreseeable future, I made the decision to move back to New Jersey, and I worked remotely at Amgen, which was still is based out of Florida from my home in New Jersey. But in the meantime, right, I was looking for a role here in New Jersey because I knew that or I hoped at least at the time, right, that this pandemic was going to be temporary, and that I would be able to I would have to go back to the office at some point. So I wanted something local. Yeah.
Okay, great, and that's where you ended up in your current role at Bed Bath & Beyond. So you make that transition, get to stay close to home, and I think you made that. Was that early 2021, or when was that transition made?
I moved back in August 2020.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
August 2020, and I worked remotely with Amgen for pretty much a year until I joined Bed Bath & Beyond in June of this year.
Great. In your current role, can you kind of walk us through some of the highlights of what you do? I mean, what are you enjoying about your current role? And then, I think, anything around what the current environment is. Again, I know we're always talking about remote work and the pandemic, and that's probably a topic that we're a little sick of right now at the end of 2021. But with this being a podcast, I assume in the future is going to be a little bit more of a rare topic. So, you kind of tell me about your current role.
Yeah, I think, and this is probably going to be more common than not. We're given the choice of whether we want to work remote or not, right? And most people are leaning towards remote just because of the convenience of being at home, So that's what's currently going on with my role, right? I think, and it's still being defined because it's so new, on what the going back into the office is going to look like. Is it going to happen? When is it going to happen? So as we figure that out, as of now, the plan is just to go into the office for quarterly meetings or stuff like that. But as of now, I haven't gone into the office yet.
Great. I mean, your experience having been someone who was in an office and is now gone. I think from 2013 till about 2018, I was remote. Had kind of lived that life before the pandemic. So for me, I was returning back to a remote world. But are there any specific transitions as a procurement professional that you feel like you're having to do differently when you're out of the office as opposed to being in the office, or is it just been kind of business as usual? Really, not a lot of adjustments made.
I think setting up a home office, it took some trial and error to really find what I liked. But other than that, I feel at least the teams that I've been involved with, they're very professional, very, it's not like they're I don't know, watching TV and just leaving their computer. So everybody's really responsive. So it's not as fast as me like just turning and asking like, hey, Jerry, blah, 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 you know. But I do feel like if I send an IM or an email, I'm not ignored and I get responses. So yeah, other than, you know, having 2 monitors and a comfortable chair, I haven't really had any issues.
Good to hear. Okay. Kind of coming, you know, something I want to do towards the end of these podcasts is again, I view these as probably geared more towards obviously procurement professionals, but people at the beginning of their career, people considering procurement, people in college. I guess, you know, what's a key takeaway? You know, so from the beginning of your education through your career to this point, what's something you wish you would have known before, you know, day one of your career? Advice to yourself as you began your career. What would you tell yourself? What would you do differently?
Of my career or of my college experience?
I guess career. Let's say career.
Okay, of my career, I guess, you know, really focus on. I think you should think of your career as a marathon and not a sprint, and think of, you know, even if it's the most entry level role in the world, like what skills can you develop here that can serve you on the next role, right? Or make you a little bit better towards role that you're trying to have. So I guess when you start, even if it's not accurate, and I can almost guarantee that it'll change along the way, try to have an end goal of where you want to be, right? Whether that's a manager or director or VP or whatever it is, right? And think what skills are required for that role and what skills do you have, and try to fill in those gaps with. It could be something as simple as just, you know, having conversations with your superior, right? Who may have experiences with negotiations that you do not, and asking like, hey, can I sit in on this? So being more, not being afraid to ask to, you know, opportunities to grow, I think is good, because I think most people, I mean, some people are gonna, you know, kind of shoo you away, but most people are gonna be receptive towards that.
No, I like that a lot. Yeah, I think so. So just to restate what I hear from you, you know, one, your career is a marathon, not a sprint, and kind of beginning with the end in mind. You know, looking at what you want to accomplish, starting there, and then moving backwards to, you know, what types of skills, what type of, you know, characteristics, what type of, you know, character do I want to build, and then also being willing to reach out. And I think you're exactly right. I think we as humans, I think we very much discount how much people just want to help. Like, people enjoy being helpful and useful. I think far more often we don't ask for, you know, hey, can you give me feedback? Can you mentor me in this area? Can you teach me that? Or how do you go about doing this? I think it's something we don't do. But I mean, anytime someone does it to me, like asks me, hey, I want to develop this stuff, it's exciting. I love the opportunity to help someone out. I think it's human nature, but we're often so afraid to ask.
Right. I think there's going to be, you know, cases where, you know, someone's going to be in a bad mood or just, you know, not want to help. But I think for the majority of the times, like, most people are going to be, you know, happy to assist you or show you something new.
Great. All right. Well, hey, Alonso, I think we're at a good time right now. So just want to thank you for being a part of one of our first episodes. You know, all the listeners out there, appreciate you, you know, tuning in and walking through this. And, you know, we'll have another episode in a couple of weeks.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you. Nice talking to you.
Bye.